All right, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sunday School Dropouts podcast. We are so excited that you are all here with us today.
Every time you say that, I feel like there needs to be fanfare in the background. Like, woo! Like kids' voices cheering, like Sunday school. I don't know.
We could probably get that little sound bite. I don't know.
I know. We'll have to do that. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Did you ever cheer when you were in Sunday school or Sabbath school?
Yeah, Sabbath school, right. I don't know. I feel like cheering was frowned upon because it wasn't,
Probably. Because that could be too fun.
I mean, a hearty amen might have been appropriate, but if there was any clapping, we were not charismatic. So anything that got too emotionally, was very quickly stifled. So
this is true. Unless it's like, joy of the Lord.
I was just going to say that. I was like, only the joy of the Lord. Otherwise, you tone that down. Tone that down.
But even then, you have to make sure you're not too joyful in the Lord, because that could be, gratuitous or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't be gratuitous in the Lord. Just be joyful.
Yeah, there's a difference. I'm not sure how, but I'm sure there's a difference.
I'm sure there is. Somebody can give us the guidelines for it. Well, then in that joyful spirit, I'm excited about our episode today, and our guest that we have.
Oh, me too. Yeah, when you told me who it was going to be, and then anyway, I will let you say more about all of that, but I'm very excited about her and her upcoming book, and just very excited to have her on.
Yeah. So we are in the middle of our Religious Trauma and the Elections series, where we've been talking to a variety of different people who understand religious trauma, how it can coincide with the election, and different facets. And so we'll get more into her official bio soon, but we have with us today Angela Denker, who is an author, and she's written one book. She has another book coming out, which is the book we're going to be focusing on a lot today, which is called The White Disciples of Jesus. And Andrew and I both had a chance to read it prior to our interview today, and it's a really good book. So I'm excited for everybody to hear the discussion that we have with her. What do you think of the book?
Oh, yeah, it's so interesting. It's so interesting. And I know we've spoken to this before, like you and I, like it's just the radicalization of, white boys, quite frankly. And having worked in the school system and the juvenile justice system a lot myself before I worked with CTRR. It's something that I've really been seeing for quite a few years as it unfolds. And seeing someone who's like, this is what they focus on in their research, I'm really excited to, be able to have a conversation with somebody that this is what they do. This is their work. And so I'll love to hear what her take is on all of this.
Yeah, I'm excited too. And for those of you who haven't yet caught our last episode conversation with Dan Miller, we do touch on this just like a little bit, but we kind of reserved our thoughts for this episode because we knew it would be the focus of this episode. So before we get too much into the episode, I do want to let people know that the Center for Trauma Resolution and Recovery does have 3 different religious trauma and the election support groups that are starting this week, but we still have room if you want to participate in them. We'll put a link in the show notes, or you can just go to traumaresolutionandrecovery.com and click the support groups link. But these groups are meant to help you feel less alone. We're not going to be talking about who you should vote for, how to vote on certain issues, but just a place for support, because we know that the elections can feel like a lot of chaos and crisis. It can oftentimes feel very lonely, as maybe we are polarized from different friends or family. And so we just wanted to offer some of these groups for people to come 2 weeks before the elections, the week of the elections, and 2 weeks after, to just kind of process and have a place to feel seen, a break from the crisis, and hopefully be able to connect with other people that can feel supportive. So check those out if you're interested. Like I said, we'll put a link in the show notes, but also you can just go to our website or our Instagram and find out more information there. And I'm excited because I'm leading one of those groups, so it should be fun. And then there's a couple of other really amazing practitioners. So join us.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing resource. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm excited about all of this.
I'm excited.
All the stuff that we're offering.
I am excited. All right. Well, just a little disclaimer that we always offer. We do recognize that some of the topics that we talk about, especially a topic like this, can sometimes be triggering for people. Our goal here is to help you listen to yourself and what you need. So feel free to take what you take what you need, leave what you don't. And if that means you have to skip the entire episode and come back another time, we totally understand. But this episode is for you. But I think before we get into our conversation with Angela, we should have a vocabulary lesson.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. For our vocabulary lesson today, we are going to be talking about gaslighting.
I love gaslighting.
Yep. It is. Seriously, it is such a commonly used term, and I mean, it's so interesting because the origin of that word is not even really all that recent, but I feel like it has like really blown up in the past 5 years, 10 years, especially for how often people use it, and unfortunately misuse it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So the origin of the word, I'm going to probably get the year wrong, but it's like 1943, 44, something like that. It's a film with Ingrid Bergman as the starring leading lady, called Gaslight. And the whole movie is about her feeling like she's going crazy because her husband / con man is doing all of these things intentionally to try to make her feel crazy. And in those days, lights were controlled by gas. And so you could kind of turn them up or down and they could flicker and things like that. And so, that's where we get the term gaslighting. And it's this idea, this phenomenon that happens when somebody is intentionally doing things to you, questioning your reality, questioning kind of your psychological state with the intention of making you feel like you are crazy, or in some ways, even psychologically terrorizing you. So in the movie, she is made to believe that she's seeing things, hearing things that aren't happening are happening, and vice versa, to the point where she's about to be going to an institution, because back in those days, that's what they did, before the truth comes out and we find that, her husband has been doing all these things. So yeah, gaslighting definitely has this intentional, consistent over time. Doesn't happen it's not just once. It's intentional. It's over time. And yeah, those two things is what makes it stand out as different than I think how we talk about it in our colloquial kind of spaces.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I think what you said about the intentional piece is what's so important, because I definitely know just from seeing Reels and TikTok videos that oftentimes I feel like the way a lot of folks use it is, you'll have an example of some folks who maybe just are in a disagreement about something. They two people remember a shared event a little differently, and and maybe one of them is a jerk, to be fair, but then that being like, oh, you're gaslighting me now. And the thing is, that doesn't mean someone's not being a jerk, perhaps, maybe they're even being manipulative. But it's that the intentional piece, like you said, and then the over time, like it's like there's like a means to an end. There's like a bigger picture here that's happening, and it is. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is too strong of a word, but I mean, I would describe it as predatory usually.
I think so.
It's intentional manipulation. Yeah. So
it's for sure malicious. Yeah. Like this. And I think that's the difference. Like with the intentional piece, like the person who's doing it to you knows what they are doing. And the reason they're doing it is to manipulate, to get a means to their end, to make you feel like you're crazy. So you're not trusting yourself and your own reality. And yeah, it does happen over the span of time versus just one or two times. Like where we all, like as humans, we just experience things differently. We remember things differently. We take different things out of conversations and experiences. So it's like, I mean, we had our VBS experience at the Ark Encounter where we were both at the same place, and took in like the same surroundings, but it's very possible that we could have a conversation. You could say, oh, I saw this thing or read this thing, and maybe I didn't, even though I was there too. And for me to say like, no way, they didn't really say that. Like, I think colloquially people would be like, you're gaslighting me. And it's like, no, or we just had like different experiences and we took different things out of it. But definitely not gaslighting.
What would be some of the appropriate ways to use this term, gaslighting? Is it, I mean, or are there even appropriate times to use it?
Yeah. I do think that there's appropriate times to use it, because I do think that, you know, I remember when I was first introduced to the term as a way to help me understand the abuse and the abusive relationship that I had been in, and then ultimately also the abusive religion that I had been in, it was helpful to have a term to say, oh, this is what is happening. This is why I feel crazy all the time, because we'll use my abusive ex-partner. He was constantly saying these things and doing these things. Like, so this situation would happen and he would say, no, that's not how it happened. It happened like this, or this, or this, or you did this or this. And he knew that it hadn't happened that way, but he was so convincing and did that so much that for me, I started to question, like, maybe I am the crazy one. Like, maybe I am the one who is in the wrong here, or I need to change my behaviors. This is a perfect example because it's so asinine now that I've been out of this for over a decade. But he is an alcoholic, and he would drink to oblivion every night, just so much, to the point where I don't even know how he is still alive, because he should have had, alcohol poisoning. So he would do that every night. I also drank every night. One drink, maybe not even the full drink. And so the times where I would say, I'm really concerned about this, these things are happening, he would always throw back in my face, well, you drink the same number of nights that I do, which was like a little bit true, right? Because I did, but I did not drink the quantity he did. I didn't drink for the same reasons that he did. And so he would tell me this over and over. Well, you're an alcoholic too, because you drink the same number of nights. You're an alcoholic too, because of this or that, because you don't remember this or that or whatever. Until I started to wonder, am I an alcoholic? Like, maybe he's right, because I do have a drink every night. Now, granted, it was to deal with the anxiety of what he was doing. But it was this idea of, like, I was then starting to question my reality and starting to actually consider, do I need to go to AA? Do I need to do these things? Because maybe I am an alcoholic. I think that's like a good example of gaslighting, because we see like the extreme nature of it. And it was done with this malicious intent to try to get me to question my sanity, as well as to get the blame off of him. Yeah. No, absolutely, and I think it is a very useful word when used with a specific definition in a clinical sense. It does help. I think it helps a lot of people put meaning to like the experience they've been through. Yeah. Do you feel like when it comes to like high control religion, do you see people using it in ways that seems helpful?
Like using the term in ways that is helpful? Yeah, I was actually just thinking that, because when you were describing it, I'm like, systemically, like that is kind of what high control religion does. It makes you question. Yeah. It makes you question your own lived experience, your own reality, and it's whether we're talking on a personal level or a systemic level. It's like, then what it does is, you don't trust yourself anymore. You're not sure which way is up, so to speak, and then it allows the other person, whether it's a church, a pastor, a partner, whatever, to like. They can change the goalposts all they want, and you being confused by it they can then put it back on you. Like, well, you're the one who's clearly misremembering. You're the one who's at fault somehow, even though, it's but to your initial question, definitely, I think it's very helpful, and I think it fits in the context of high control religion.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Okay, I have a soapbox to get on a little bit. Because I've heard this on social media, like that we can self-gaslight, or I gaslight myself. And I'm just going to get on a soapbox, and you can totally disagree with me, but I think that categorically that is wrong. You cannot gaslight yourself. for the sheer reason, if you look in the definition, there is intention to cause harm. To suggest that you can then gaslight yourself means that you're intentionally causing harm to make yourself go crazy. That to me does not usually work. However, I do believe that we can introject people's messages, meaning that people can say things to us over and over and over, and we internalize them to the point where we believe that they're coming from within ourselves. And that might be what people call self-gaslighting. But I would invite people to consider, like, did that actually originate in you, or did that start from outside of you that you are now taking that message, believing it about yourself? And that's what we feel like is self-gaslighting. But I've gotten into it on social media a couple times with people that are like, oh, it's self-gaslighting. I'm like, I really don't think it is, but maybe I'm wrong. What do you think, Andrew?
Oh, I agree with you. And I understand why they're saying what they're saying, but I do think that's rooted in a misconception of what gaslighting is in the first place. So it's like when you have that initial definition of what gaslighting is, then I think naturally like you're saying, that just naturally extends to, okay, well, this being the definition, self-gaslighting, that doesn't really actually make sense.
Yeah. It is interesting because I think it's important then, part of what we do in abusive and high control systems or relationships is we end up taking on a lot of blame and trying to work things out that we think are our own issues that in reality are maybe a result of the system or the relationship. That when we start to explore that, it starts to become very clear, like, oh, that's somebody else, whether that's a person or a system or parents or pastors or whatever. They put that on me. When I can understand that and untangle how that lives inside me, it offers compassion, curiosity, and ultimately, I think, healing.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So one final question. How do you know if you're gaslighting someone? Since it's my favorite thing to do. I'm just kidding.
I mean, that's a fair question, though. I will say this. I mean, I think that based on the definition of it being intentional, it being long-term, and it kind of being this malicious thing, if you're concerned that you are doing it, you're probably not gaslighting, at least not in the context of the full definition. Now, that does not mean to say that you maybe aren't behaving harmfully or even manipulatively, and that's
right.
Okay, then we can address those specific dynamics and what's going on and how is that showing up and, what's happening. But just because of the term and all of what it means, it's like I've said with being a narcissist. If you're concerned about it, you probably aren't, because that just kind of goes against the nature of how that works. So
that maybe is the next vocabulary lesson is narcissism.
That's a good one.
Yeah, we'll have to come back to that. But I agree with you. Usually if you're asking yourself those questions and demonstrating that awareness, then you're on a good trajectory that perhaps it's not gaslighting. However, I think it's always good to do that reflection, of like, what are my intentions here? Is it to get somebody to do what I want them to do? To get this very specific outcome that I wouldn't get if I didn't go this route? And then we can reflect on that and perhaps have different conversations or learn how to ask somebody to, make requests versus, essentially tricking them into things.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, that was a great vocabulary lesson.
Yeah, those are fun.
Reverend Angela Denker is an ELCA Lutheran pastor and a veteran journalist. Her first book, Red State Christians, was the 2019 Silver Forward Indies Award winner for political and social sciences. She is a columnist for the Minnesota Star Tribune and has written for many publications, including Sports Illustrated, The Washington Post, and Fortune magazine, and has appeared on CNN, BBC, Sky News, and NPR to share her research on politics and Christian nationalism in the United States. Pastor Angela lives with her husband and 2 sons in Minneapolis, where she is a sought-after speaker on Christian nationalism and its theological and cultural roots. She also serves Lake Nokomis Lutheran Church in Minneapolis as pastor of visitation and public theology. Pastor Angela's new book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood, will be released on March 25th, 2025. Angela's core message that she hopes people take away from her work is that Christian nationalism is a dangerous, authoritarian movement grounded in racism, sexism, and religious fundamentalism. And it is best countered by building trust, speaking truth, love, and setting boundaries. And I think you will see that in our conversation today. So let's get into it. Welcome, Angela, to the Sunday School Dropouts podcast. It is so good to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited for this conversation. You were so generous as to send us your newest book ahead of time. So I know both Andrew and I had the chance to read it. I had some long flights and airport time last week where I got to read your book. But I wonder if you'll just share with us kind of like a high level overview of what you do professionally, as well as kind of what drew you into this work, this research, not only for the book that you have coming out, but as well as the book that you have already released.
Yeah, well, I started out my calling sort of to journalism. And so I began as a sports writer, worked in sports writing in Florida, covering hockey, spent a lot of time in locker rooms. But I always felt this calling to share the truth in a deeper way and to attend seminary. But also I always had this cynicism about the church and what it could do to people and what it had even done to people in my own family. So then I did go to seminary, became a Lutheran pastor, served a few churches that were sort of evangelical style, Lutheran in name. And during the 2016 election, I was serving a congregation of that style in Orange County, California, right next to the Nixon Library.
Interesting.
And so I kind of had a front row seat to watching the Rick Warren evangelicalism of Orange County become seduced by Trumpism. And even within my own congregation, the other pastor who I worked with, he and I were both ELCA Lutheran pastors, but the rest of our staff came from a very conservative evangelical background. So I watched the church fracture along political lines. And from that experience was born then my first book, Red State Christians, in which I spent 2018 traveling across the country, interviewing Christians in red states and counties. And since then have moved back to Minneapolis about 7 years ago and have continued to work to put together this blend of doing ministry, but also reporting really honestly about the trauma of the church and trying to find a space where I can speak to people that would never walk through a church door, but may have some sort of hunger for spirituality. Because I think that's such a strong hunger, especially among people my age. So that's where I am. I'm currently a newspaper columnist, and then I work part-time as a pastor of visitation and public theology at a Lutheran church here in Minneapolis, and continue to write and report on my Substack as well.
That's awesome.
Nice.
That's awesome. And I mean, you wrote Red State Christians, and I know we're going to have you back on in a few months to talk more about your new book coming out. But would you mind sharing just a little bit about that book and the research you're doing there?
Yes, thanks. Well, it's kind of like when I first wrote Red State Christians, I even myself was naive about the extent to which Christian nationalism and Trumpism and the radicalization of religious violence within right-wing Christianity was going to just continue to grow and grow every single day, it seems like. So the new book much continues in that vein, even as I thought, I want to step away from religion and politics. Nope.
Yeah, it's like very married.
Book,
yeah.
Right. I mean, this next book, it's called Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. So it's less political in the sense that it doesn't have Trump in the title. But I really got an opportunity to report on, what's going on with white Christian boys and men. And really, it attempts to attack this issue from two separate ends. From one end, the extent to which white boys and men have become a danger to many others through violence, through things like mass shootings, but also domestic violence and violence in the home. And then the other end of it is the extent to which white boys and men are in trouble, and they're in trouble internally in what's happening among this group themselves, which for me as a mom of 2 white boys is also a really important internal question. So the book comes at it from an angle of honesty about the danger and also real compassion and the knowledge that we need to fix this internally as well as externally.
Yeah. I was commenting to Laura earlier, like, I really appreciate you writing on this topic so specifically. I haven't seen a lot of others, at least not to the extent that you have, really deep dive it. And some of my background is before I did what I do now, which is coaching with CTRR, I worked a lot in school systems as a counselor. Also Department of Juvenile Justice, and I still remember, as long ago as maybe 2014 and 2015, I couldn't put my finger on it or how to articulate it, but it was there's middle school with boys, that just seems to be a moment of transformation, and it seems to be trending in a way that's kind of concerning, clearly. And so, I mean, all of that to say, I do really appreciate you writing this. When I saw the subtitle, I'm like, oh, I think this is something that's going to resonate, so I'm really happy to hear you expanding on all of that.
Thank you. Yeah, just one of those things. Whenever I tell somebody about what I'm writing about, everybody has a story. Everybody has a boy or a young man in their life who they want to talk about and they want to share about. And sometimes it's a story that they're ashamed to share. A lot of progressive parents, they're like, where is this coming from? Why is my child getting radicalized in this right-wing way? And for those of us who grew up more in that environment, it's like, well, of course. But some people, for them, this is really new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wonder, could you speak to that a little bit more? This idea of having grown up in the environment, as sad as it sounds, it's like, this makes so much sense, right? But it's been really interesting because this election cycle in particular, I feel like white Christian nationalism is so at the forefront that so many people who didn't grow up like this can see it, right? And they're like, oh my gosh, this is this new thing, right? Should we be concerned about it? I heard another podcast I have a friend who's the host of it, and he did not grow up in this system, understands dynamics of high control religion and cults and things like that. But he was saying one time, he's like, yeah, I guess I'm seeing it now. Do we need to be concerned? And the person they were interviewing was like, yeah, this, we've known this for decades. We've seen this. I don't think we could have imagined that it could have gotten to this, as we're seeing it play out in our national kind of landscape. But yeah, this is something to be concerned about. And I feel like there's so many people that are just now starting to understand that it's a thing and maybe hitting on the tip of the iceberg as to why it's so dangerous. So I don't know if you can, speak to that.
Yes. I often look at it through both a pastoral lens, but also through a journalist and media lens. And I think so much national media coverage of Christianity, especially of conservative Christianity, has tended to cover it as a spectacle. Wow, look at this crazy pastor out in the Midwest flyover country, and look at all the crazy things he's saying. And when it's covered in that way, they make it look as though it's this nutty thing, but they don't understand the power behind it. And also they don't understand the money behind it. And there is so much, as we know, so much money and power that is behind right-wing Christianity in this country. And so I think its impact has been minimized because so many in national media have covered it as a spectacle, and they don't understand its power and its influence. And I think for those of us who were raised in it too, I just think it's been so important to hear the voices of people who were brought up and what that's like to grow up in as a child. I think that's been really, really important. And I'm encouraged to see national media starting to tell more of these stories, but there's still a long, long way to go.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm not trying to give a plug for a whole other series or whatever, but it made me think of when I first watched what's that docuseries, Shiny Happy People.
Oh, yeah.
And watched it with my partner, who she did not grow up in. I mean, she grew up in the Bible Belt, but she did not grow up in a fundamentalist church culture like I did, like a lot of us did. And I just remember, we kind of had that conversation where it was like, everyone's watching this and talking about it, like, oh my God, is that what it's? I mean, like, that's so like a spectacle. When you said that, that resonated. But it was like, that's. I mean, I didn't grow up in the IBLP particularly. I was in Seventh-day Adventism, but like culturally, the flavor, the aesthetic, like, no, that was it. Like, that was normal. Yeah. This isn't weird. The umbrella model was in our Bible textbooks, for example. You know, I mean, it wasn't just a spectacle. Like, that was the culture, and it was pervasive.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, you said that statement about, white men and boys are dangerous and white men and boys are in trouble, especially since your research has spanned all the way, pre-COVID, where I feel like things really took another turn. Yeah. Can you marry those together? Like the research that you did for Red State Christians and how we are getting to this conclusion of white men and boys are both dangerous and in trouble?
Yeah, I think one of the key truths that I first heard in Red State Christians that has really, really played out to be true is that I remember I was interviewing an evangelical pastor who at the time was on the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. And he was really one of the first to drive home to me just how entrenched Christian nationalism was within his denomination. And of course, since then, we've had the clergy abuse come out in the Southern Baptist Convention. We've seen the scandal with the Falwells at Liberty University. So much has changed since then. This was 2018 that he was telling me this. But one of the things he said to me was that what he has seen is that when people are forced to choose between their theology and their faith commitments and their political commitments, they're going to choose their political commitments every single time.
Wow.
And we have certainly seen that play out when it comes to Donald Trump and when it comes to Donald Trump's Christian followers. And I think it was really exposed in COVID, too, for me. For a long time, I had tried to have such this place of compassion and understanding for the anti-abortion movement, even as, a woman who's gone through my own miscarriage and, seeing firsthand how important reproductive health care is. And then when I saw in COVID that these folks who had always sort of placed themselves, like their main thing is to shame and to say, well, you're in favor of killing babies. And it just, for those of us who were raised in these traditions, it makes you feel like so bad. But then to watch them be so quick to say, well, human lives, we need to get the economy back going. We need to get these things open because the economy and our money is the most important thing. And you see that with immigration too, and even like looking at the war in Gaza. I mean, human lives become so dispensable and disposable. And if there's one like truth that I hold on to as like the kernel of my faith, is just that human lives and humanity cannot be disposable ever. And so to hear that kind of hypocrisy from a movement that has always claimed to hold the moral high ground, that really was just a moving thing for me, where I realized that the political commitments had become really central in place of faith commitments for many who would define themselves to be rooted in Christianity.
Yeah. Why do you think that is?
I think, I lay a lot of the blame in Red State Christians. One of the truths that I just return to again and again is like, yes, it's very easy to be mad at Donald Trump, and he's a, pretty despicable human being. But at the same time, I have much more anger and blame placed at the foot of religious leaders and pastors. And so they're the ones who have, claimed this godly calling and claimed this mission and this passion to preach the gospel. And instead of preaching the gospel, instead of teaching about the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, they've taught right-wing politics. and they have preached the gospel of the Republican Party. And they've done a great job at that. They have preached that gospel, and it has come across, and people have believed and given their lives to it. And what's been sacrificed is the story of who Jesus really is. And that, to me, is a egregious offense.
Yeah, when I hear that, I think a lot about dynamics of power and control.
Yeah.
Finding messages that exert power and control individually as well as collectively. And I mean, Kristen Cobes-Dumais talks about this in her book, Jesus and John Wayne, like this idea of Jesus as a servant, as somebody who's humble, doesn't feel big and powerful and, like Braveheart, like John Wayne, right? And I just, that hunger for power, it just feels so apparent at this point.
Yeah. I was thinking about that. My father-in-law died this past week, and we were at his funeral service on Saturday at a Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, which is sort of the conservative evangelical branch of Lutheranism. And the pastor shared the gospel from John 11, which is sort of Martha's confession of faith, that Jesus is the Redeemer. And so the pastor is sharing, and I heard the pastor say very clearly, like, Jesus doesn't comfort us by holding our hand. And it was very much this thing of like, that Jesus is this militant redeemer. And so much, of course, for the Missouri Synod grounded in the fact that if you're baptized in the Missouri Synod. But what really stuck out to me is that if you know the passage John 11, just before that confession of faith, Jesus weeps at his friend's death. And Jesus is vulnerable, and Jesus is weak, and Jesus is in pain because of the death of his friend. And I think that just reminds me so much of what has been done to American Christianity, particularly white American Christianity, is that we've taken they've told over and over again the story of Jesus turning over the tables, that Jesus is this violent, tough guy. But they don't say the reason Jesus is doing that is because it's become a grift, that people in the temple are trying to make money off of their faith. And certainly that is right at the root of prosperity gospel, most of the popular American preachers today. So it's just been really, really hard to watch. But also I think, I gain strength from looking at history, that this isn't the first time throughout history that religious leaders have attempted to use the gospel for personal gain and power and violence. So we've been here before, and that's what I try to remember.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, this is, just this recent, and maybe resurgence isn't even the right word, but this recent resurgence of white Christian nationalism over the last 8 years, the last 10 years. I'm just curious what your take is on what is the cause of that? Because like you said, I know it's been around. It's not like this is a new phenomenon, but it's certainly coming back with a vengeance, it feels like.
Yeah, I think it's this sense for right-wing American Christians and evangelicals that they're losing the culture wars. Gay marriage was legalized. Women have continued to make some gains in representation, in women's rights, the Me Too movement. And I think it really is, much like the writings of Heather Cox Richardson, where she reminds us of what happened in the aftermath of the Civil War and how these gains for equality for African Americans were pushed back. It happened after the Civil Rights Movement with the 80s. And I think this is a backlash to really this sense that the progressive movement is making strides to really changing what American culture looks like. Demographically, white people will no longer be in the majority in the United States in a matter of years. And certainly with the younger generations, they're growing up seeing in a much more multi-religious, multicultural, multiracial environment than most of us did. So I think it's this desperate sense of we're losing, we have to win. And you can see that in the win at all costs, like, okay, well, we'll just, throw off this thing that we used to believe in. We'll throw off this thing that we used to believe in. Adultery, who cares? You know, we just got to win.
Yeah. Yeah. I had a conversation with a family member prior to the 2016 elections. And, you know, I think the first time I ever like really started to understand politics was, you know, when Bill Clinton had his whole, you know, affair. Well, we call it affair, whatever. It was power and control. That's a whole other conversation. But I mean, like, I had known obviously who the president was before then, but I was younger, so I wasn't in a position to have much opinion on it. But I remember so many conversations around the dinner table that character mattered, and we have to have somebody in power, in a position of power, who can, you know, take care of themselves and their families and, you know, exercise things like self-control. And, you know what, and it was just like so hammered into us. And then we have 2016, or the lead up to 2016, we have the Billy Bush, you know, kind of leak tape. And I remember having a conversation with a family member going, can you reconcile this for me? Because I remember you telling me this, and now you're going to vote for this person. How does that fit? And that particular family member really made them think. They actually ended up voting differently as a result of that conversation. But then that same conversation with another family member, they dug in even harder and were like, no, this is what we have to vote for because of all these reasons that were very different than how I had been taught growing up. And I feel like I don't think I'm an outlier in that story. I feel like maybe a lot of people have dealt with things like that.
Yes. And that's so much at the center of so much of my work is just this knowledge that, you know, these are our family members. These are our loved ones. And so it's always coming from this place of pain, this place of compassion. And again, that's where I think so much of the national reporting falls flat, because if it doesn't report it as a spectacle, it just reports it as, you know, people that are like aliens. And that's not the experience of most Americans, I think. And, you know, recently there was news came out about, you know, Tim Walz's brother, that he was a Trump supporter. He wasn't going to be supporting his brother for vice president. And I just thought that was so relatable to so much of the work that I do. And if we talk about, you know, for fellow white Christians or for people who grew up in white Christianity, there is such a responsibility. Like, these are our people. And there's a responsibility to talk about it and to come from a place of compassion, but also boundaries.
Yeah. I shared this a little bit before we started recording, but there is a lot in the book that I resonated with in terms of just the people. So I live in the South now. I've lived here for almost 15 years. I feel like I have a pretty robust understanding of the culture here. I know Andrew has also been in the South. But the first almost 30 years of my life was in the North, and a little bit in metropolitan areas, but mostly in rural areas. And in your more recent book, or the book that's about to come out, you know, you're really hitting, the book starts in the South and you're moving into rural areas. And it felt so relatable, because I was like, oh, you're talking about the people that I grew up with. Like, I know these church meetings and I know these people, but I just, you know, I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about these people that are quote unquote outliers, or, you know, the weirdos, or why is there such an appeal to that, you know, in some of these areas of the country?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a whole book on it. I wrote another book. There's still, like, I feel like I'm still uncovering the answer to that question. I just started reading that book, Angry White Men, by a sociologist, and he really comes at it from, you know, looking at this sense where for a group of folks who've been in positions of power, any move toward equality feels like, oh my gosh, what an injustice. Yes. So there's certainly some of that going on. But it comes from, this place of pain, despair, broken community bonds, feeling of being unheard. I recently, just last week, had an exchange with a rural pastor out in the rural Midwest. He's, you know, retired, but kind of coming back to serving congregations. And he was just like, I'm struggling so much with this election. I don't know what to do. And it came down to that he And some fellow clergy people had tried to reach out to then, I believe it was then Congressman Walz, about something that was happening in their rural community. And they felt like he hadn't heard them. And Donald Trump has had this innate sense to make rural people, especially rural white people, especially, and men, feel like he hears them. And it's like playing at this base level of anger and this, you know, because Trump was from Queens and he wanted to be a Manhattanite. And he had this sense of like, oh, these people in the New York Times have never really, like, I'm not really one of them. And so he gets at that sense. But anyway, so I had this exchange with this pastor, and I was able to just say to him, like, it does sound like Walz really dropped the ball. And my hope would be that if he heard this story, that he would really be apologetic for it. But I can understand your cynicism. And this pastor wrote back to me. He said, you know what? I think I'm going to let it go. He's like, just hearing you say, you know, he dropped the ball. He's like, I've dropped the ball in my life too. And he's been a good governor, and we just need some competence. So I think I'm going to maybe, you know, vote Democrat, which was a big deal for him.
Wow. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But that's so, I mean, I know it's an anecdote, but so powerful. I mean, so, you know, how powerful just simply being validated is. And so it's like, and then just by extension, this idea, whether it's, you know, white men or white folks in general, or just rural working class folks, this perception, whether it's real or not, but if you believe the people in power don't see you, don't hear you, don't care, and then suddenly a politician is rising to power who is in fact saying the right things, is acknowledging you, like, oh my God, it makes so much sense.
And telling you who you should blame and who you should be mad at.
Yes. Oh,
So nice.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, it feels easier. Yeah. I'm curious. Okay, so you're saying, you know, Donald Trump has this like knack for being able to speak to some very specific groups of people that are oftentimes, you know, misunderstood or not heard, feeling alone. Going back to the statement of like white men and boys are in trouble, I wonder, like, does that go together then? Like this feeling of like we're in trouble, or I'm in trouble, right? Because maybe my power, my position is being threatened, which is then our natural human inclination to hold tighter and dig our heels in further. Like, I wonder, is the right offering like a solution for I'm in trouble, you have a solution for me? Is it an identity thing? I've done a bit of a deep dive into this over the last like probably year or so of, you know, why we have some of these more extreme groups that young white boys in particular are being drawn towards, like the Andrew Tates. And why is it that they are? And there's so much of like a feeling of connection, identity, I matter, I'm being listened to, and they're not in other areas of life. And I just wonder if you can kind of speak to that.
I think identity is such a big piece of all of this. You know, identity was at the center of what I found in my research for Red State Christians, and it's so much at the center of what's going on now for white male masculinity. And I do think that, you know, coming from the perspective looking at the schools or looking at, you know, what kids are learning about in school and culturally, what's, you know, last summer, the summer of 2023, it was like the summer of Barbie, the summer of Taylor Swift. And I think we've done, and I even look back to, you know, my own childhood in the late 80s and, you know, 90s. We've done a really good job of saying like girls should take on what are stereotypically masculine traits. You know, you should be strong, you should be powerful, you know, go be a boss, which now we've realized like that wasn't the right entire message either, because you can't do everything. But what's happened, I think, with boys and men is there's been a neglecting in large part of saying that it's okay for boys to take on what we would think of traditionally as feminine characteristics. There's still sort of this cultural expectation that boys shouldn't cry, or that, you know, boys should be providers, or they should be strong. And so it's like, well, it's cool for women to be firefighters or construction workers. But maybe we haven't said as strongly, like, it's cool for men to be in the caring professions. It's cool for men to be sensitive. It's cool for men to, be emotional. And I think we're starting to see a little bit more of that. And I think that's really important. And I see a lot of dads really wanting to do that with their kids. But I think we have a long way to go because culturally, even if you look at movies or novels, like we've emphasized the strong female character, but we haven't necessarily moved away from what a male leading man is supposed to look like and act like.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of our next episodes, we're going to be kind of doing a deep dive on Project 2025. And so I was very, very much wanting to get some of your thoughts on that. And just in the greater context of what we're talking about, red state Christians and white Christian nationalism and all that. But yeah, definitely we'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I mean, this is getting into the J.D. Vance of it all.
Yeah.
I think we really see in the transition from Mike Pence to J.D. Vance, you can just look at the two types of Christianity that those two men represent, and you can see the evolution of where white conservative Christianity has gone from 2016 to and from 2020 to 2024. And so in J.D. Vance, so much of even like the gaffes that he's had in the awkwardness and some of these interviews that he's done where he's shaming cat ladies or childless women, or he's saying, postmenopausal women are only valuable for taking care of grandchildren. That is evidence of a lot of time spent in right-wing male Christian corners of the internet that we may be very familiar with, because these are the folks that come in and send me crazy messages about how, I shouldn't be speaking out and I shouldn't be a pastor. But a lot of people aren't familiar with those corners. And so as J.D. Vance brings that sort of personality and ideology into the mainstream, people are like, whoa, what is this? But it's also important to note that not only does J.D. Vance come from this part of conservative Christianity, but he comes from venture capitalism. He comes from Elon Musk. And so it's like this fundamentalist religious ideology merged with a culture in which, in Silicon Valley, in engineering, where young white men have felt like we need to assert ourselves, or maybe we're not attractive to women. So what do we need to do to... And so it's this really interesting blend that he's brought to the forefront. So all this to say, okay, Project 2025, how does this connect? J.D. Vance was one of the people kind of at the center of Project 2025. I think he wrote one of the introductions to Project 2025. And Donald Trump would never write Project 2025. He'll never probably read Project 2025, and he'll disavow it. But if he's in office, he's not interested in governing. He's interested in golfing. And so the people who are actually interested in governing in a Trump administration are the folks like J.D. Vance who've been involved with Project 2025. And this is a handbook for making America a fundamentalist, religious Christian country. So if you're interested in what that might be like, look towards other fundamentalist religious countries. Look towards Iran, where women are very circumscribed as to how they dress, what they say. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at places like Afghanistan, where now women can't even have their voices heard in public. This is fundamentalism. It's not an exclusively Christian thing, but it's fundamentalism. And that's the handbook for what the United States might look like.
It's terrifying. I mean, yeah, it's flat terrifying. There's no other way to put it. And it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think there's so many people that are like, this is weird. Like, this is not going to be something that happens. And yet there's so many of us that grew up in it that are like, oh no, like this actually was the first 10, 20, 30 years of my life. And now we're wanting to do this as a country. I feel like I feel like people don't understand the long game that white conservative, white Christian nationalists have been playing essentially since the 50s, 60s of going like, we are putting plans in place to get to a moment like this. It just so happened that Donald Trump was the person we could have carry it out. But like these plans have been decades in the making. And I feel like people don't understand that unless you grew up in it and you've been told, for decades, like, oh yeah, we want, the 7 Mountains mandates. And we have all these things that we are getting ready to take over, which that's, I think what maybe feels so much more terrifying is the lack of seriousness that a lot of people are taking about things like Project 2025 as just kooky and very fringe. And it's like, no, this is like literal legislation that's ready to go.
Yeah. I mean, I think you saw that, with Trump's Supreme Court nominations where it said, they said they would respect precedent. There's no way Roe v. Wade's going to fall. And then Roe v. Wade is gone. And now, I was just reading this morning about what's really happening in states with abortion bans and how it's impacting women's health care in really devastating and terrifying ways. So I think that should have been a wake-up call. I think it was for a lot of people. But, so many leading Democrats in their governing have failed to reckon with the seriousness of this movement. And I think that one of the things that has made them fail to recognize it is they've thought that because leadership of white Christian nationalists have money and they dress nice and they have hair, this dignified haircuts, and maybe they went to Ivy League schools, it becomes the Nazi next door. And I think that money really covers up for a lot of people the real desire of this movement to take us back in time to a time in America where rights were really, really limited for the majority of Americans.
Yeah, which is just absolutely terrifying.
I still remember after the 2016 election, I so distinctly remember this conversation, and this was said by a professor in a graduate counseling program, so an very educated person, but they were just talking about the political right and like what we were seeing. They were I think trying to make themselves feel better, perhaps, but saying like, oh, these are extinction bursts, and they use that phrase specifically. And extinction bursts. And I still remember even thinking at the time, I'm like, I'm not so sure. I think it's a little more deep-seated than that. And interestingly enough to what I said earlier, it was the reason I said that. I mean, not that I think I'm a great historian or sociologist or anything, but that just what I was seeing, again, with the middle school boys that I was in the midst of that program, interning. I was at my practicum and my internship placements, working with middle school boys and just knowing the kind of stuff they were doing and talking about, like on Discord, on the internet, and TikTok wasn't even a thing yet, I don't think.
It's so well funded, I mean, I was just talking a couple weeks ago with a professor at Stanford, and he was talking about the white male students that come to him, and are some of them moving into some of these more extreme corners of the internet. And I think we've stereotyped much, and I still hear it. A lot of times people will say, oh, this is working class anxiety. And there is some of that, right? There's some of that going on, of economic displacement of rural Americans. But I think that wave has passed. And what we're really seeing now, again, is instead like this clenching on to more and more money into fewer and fewer hands, and the majority of them being, white men and women of power. So money fuels so much of this. I mean, we look at the movement to defund public education and what's happening with private schools and the takeover of so many Catholic schools by classical, quote unquote, movements. So much of this is because there's money behind it. I mean, what's happening in Christian colleges where professors who dare to speak out against Trumpism or Christian nationalism are being removed from their posts or they're being censored. So much of this is because Schools are reliant on donors because we've defunded education. So we're reliant on donors, and donors have ideological preferences. So you really have to, follow the money in order to understand where so much of this movement is rooted.
Yeah. I grew up obviously in Minnesota. So blue state values education very differently, even in rural areas than the South, where I've worked in schools as well, in a therapeutic capacity. But I have watched, so in the South, there's just a different value of public education, and the dollars don't support a robust public education, but they are all in private schools, classical schools, even homeschooling to a degree. And it's just been really wild to see, I think more now in the last probably 6 years since my state's current governor has gotten into a position of power, how they're using public education and using that as a tool to get different messages across. And I very much see it. I have a high school right across the street, and a former partner used to teach or taught there. And he would tell me how, there's not even toilet paper. There's not, utensils for kids to use for lunches and things like that. And I was like, well, where is the money going? And it's it's all going, vouchers and everything like that. It's designed so that specific messages can be taught. And I've seen it happen where I live on a consistent basis now.
And so much of that is historically tied to race, and making sure that white kids don't have to go to school with Black kids. And, it does function a little bit differently in the North, but it's sad to see in some cases, rural parts of the Midwest, North Dakota, South Dakota, which have, historically really funded public education, start to say, oh, well, how about this idea of, and it's we're borrowing from segregation academies. And it's really troubling to see. And then you have, on the other hand, you have Black and brown families that have been historically disenfranchised from public education. So then they start to hear, oh, well, let's do this voucher thing. Which is totally understandable. Let's do the homeschool thing. But then the curriculum that's available is often from a Christian nationalist lens. And it just becomes super murky, and lots of need for intersectionality understanding when it comes to all this.
Oh, it's wild. There's so many more directions I feel like we could go with this conversation.
Oh my gosh. Well, so much of it, not to take us on a tangent, but just so much of that brings up discussions around capitalism, but then the intersectionality of white evangelicalism, Christian nationalism, just white supremacy, colonialism, all the things, and how it all ties together. It really is remarkable when you start to see that, like you said, where the money goes.
It's so systemic. Absolutely. So in the midst of all the yuck, we've been borrowing this from the Straight White American Jesus podcast. They ask, they end every episode with this question of what are the reasons for hope? And curious to hear, from you, because we've talked about some heavy, dark concepts and phenomenon that is actually happening. But what would you want our listeners to come away with from this conversation? And maybe even amidst all of this, what is a reason for hope?
Yeah, I think that we've all shared in this conversation places where our conversations with our loved ones have led to change or have led to greater understanding. I'm doing an event at the end of September at St. Olaf College here in Minnesota. And the title of the event is The Threat of Christian Nationalism and Rebuilding Trust. And I think that rebuilding trust is really at the heart of where I find hope. And rebuilding trust is our best weapon against authoritarianism. Because if you look at authoritarian countries, whether it's former Soviet Russia or whether it's China, those countries thrive on people not trusting one another and thinking we can only trust the authoritarian leader. And rebuilding trust, the good news about that is that, you don't have to run a national campaign. You just have to start within your own community and your own neighbors and people near you, and, begin to build trust at really neighborhood levels, family levels. Family is super important. So where I start to see like these frayed relationships over these last 8 years of Trump and COVID and pain and fear, where I see these frayed relationships that have somehow survived and people have found compassion and truth and honesty with one another, I see God being able to work some transformation in the midst of that, or I see, the spirit or good vibes or whatever it is, but just human beings like being present with one another. There's some hope there that really turns back the appeal of Trumpism, because I do think people want some joy. And I've been really encouraged, to see that with Kamala Harris, that she's really been able to bring some joy onto the national stage. And, I'm biased, but to see the Mankato East High School football team, or Mankato West, Mankato West High School football team on stage at a Democratic National Convention, it's starting to say that not just one political party has a claim on what it means to be an American. And then there's a lot of ways to be proud to be an American. And I think that is a hopeful message. And I think people are really hungry for hope.
Yeah. I agree. I love the idea of like the individual trust built. We had a guest on last year, Andrew, I don't know if you remember, Roberto Shea, who was talking about embodied justice. Yeah. And I remember they were talking about like, it can feel so overwhelming to be like, how do I fix the country? How do I fix whatever? It's like, you don't, but you do start with like, who is around you? What is like the tangible thing I can do today in this moment? And that actually feels manageable. It feels manageable to smile at somebody, to engage in a conversation, and it doesn't even have to be political. It just can be like the human relationship. I think about, I have one friend who's like extremely different than me in all ways, religiously, politically, whatever. And yet I haven't ostracized her for that. And same, she hasn't ostracized me either. And she'll often say, like, you're the only person in my life that I can come to and talk about this, and this, because you don't judge or you don't do this or that. And I'm just like, that to me is huge. Like, I love to be known as that person in her life. And I think it's so possible to do that if we like give ourselves the little nudge to actually go do it. It does make a difference.
Yeah, definitely.
No, I loved that conversation with Roberto. I just remember the one thing I remember them saying was having a meal with somebody. Like, it's as simple as that. It can be as simple as that. So
yeah, I love that.
Yeah,
I love that. Well, Angela, it's been so great to have you here. We just kind of want to end with like where people can find you if they want to learn more about your work or pre-order your book, because they need to be doing that. Tell us a little bit about where people can find you.
Yeah, the best place to keep up with me regularly is on Substack. My Substack is called I'm Listening. It's just angeladenker.substack.com. And you can pre-order Disciples of White Jesus wherever books are sold. I'm really excited to continue having conversations. And the stories from that book, the people in that book are just really powerful. And I'm excited for their stories to be read by more and more people.
Yeah, that is awesome. And yes, since I've had the pleasure of reading it, I think it is a book very much worth reading. I think your research is great. The stories are great. And I think very compelling to just continue to build a sense of empathy and humanity for people that might be different than you, regardless of where you land on a political spectrum. So thank you. Yeah, thank you for that book and for the work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for having
so
me.
much.
All right. Thank you again to Angela Denker for that amazing conversation. How are you feeling after that, Andrew?
Oh, it was a lot of fun. I really loved just the entire conversation with her. I feel like there were so many other things we could have kept talking about. Like,
I know
an hour was not nearly long enough.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I just feel like there's so many like crossovers of like different systems, like you talked about at the end, like capitalism and racism. And, like, it's like, you don't even know where to really start or which thread to pull on because there's so much that's connected. And I think, we've said so many times, like, if you grew up in this, you're very well aware of it. But I can also see why it would be so overwhelming to somebody who's just coming into this and hearing about this essentially 70-year long game that's been played, since the 50s or whatever. And to go, wow, like, look at how this is all connected. And yet we have to start paying attention because we're seeing it happen like politically, and then we're seeing it happen like in our hometowns, in our relationships. When I was reading her book, I just found myself being able to identify with the stories that she was talking about in some of the rural areas. And I was like, these are the people that I grew up with. And when you hear their stories, it makes sense to understand why they believe certain things or why they do certain things or why they're resistant to certain things, as well as now, growing or being in a bigger city and knowing why they believe certain things, why they're resistant to certain things. Yeah, I feel like there's so much there.
Yeah, there really is. And I really like, in summary, when we were asking like where is there room for hope, basically, and rebuilding trust. Rebuilding
so
trust.
good.
I thought that was it's really powerful because it's easy to then look at all of these things that are happening and how they're playing out, and so much of it, if not all of it, is fear-based, fear-motivated. It's
Absolutely.
Inherently divisive. We know that's how nationalism / fascism works, is to alienate and find that scapegoat, and usually it's a marginalized group. And it just, it divides, and it uses fear as a motivator. So yeah, bringing joy back, rebuilding trust. I think that's so incredibly important. Both on just like an individual personal level, but then, by doing that, though, that expands to a societal level as well, though.
Yeah. I feel like anytime you humanize somebody, there's so much more room for hope. There's so much more room for change. When it's not just this group of people that believes this weird thing. And instead, when it's like, this is the person who's in front of me that we're having a conversation. I think we also find that there's a lot more that we have alike than we do that's different. But then in that sense of likeness and common humanity, that's where I think change can happen. I think we've both seen that personally, and probably even with our clients, that's where the change happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, and even just that one little anecdote that Angela shared, I forgot all of the specifics, but just literally the act of, but just the act of validating, like that. Yeah. Experience that one clergy member had when they, it's like, that sounds really frustrating. It sounds like that person dropped the ball with their interaction with you. And just that alone, that wasn't huge. Problem solving anything. It's just but she heard what they were saying. Like, I see you, and that sucks. And yet that brought them around. They're like, actually, you know what? Anyway, they kind of changed their stance a little bit and how they were going to handle it and move forward with it. And anyway, just one example, but I think that's so powerful.
I do too. I think that's incredible. And it feels tangible. Yeah. That's where I think it does feel so tangible for change, for hope, for movement. And I think it's something we can all do. That's your Sunday school homework, people. Conversations, treating people like humans, listening, joining with them, and seeing where there can be common ground and room for change.
Yeah, truly. Yeah. I think that's incredibly important.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, make sure to go and pre-order Angela's newest book, Disciples of White Jesus. Go ahead and get that wherever books are sold. We will have Angela back on in a few months to talk more specifically about that book because it is very fascinating. So I'm excited for that conversation as well.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Anything else, Andrew, for our episode today?
Yeah, if you haven't already, definitely go check out and get signed up for the Religious Trauma and the Election Support Group. That is still a resource that is available and will be available. And definitely encourage you to check it out if you haven't.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that's it. So on that note, all God's people said, Amen.
Ah, shit.